At 18, a virgin still, she was given to a widowed rancher with 3 children. Wyoming, the winter of 1878. The wind was a blade sweeping across the barren plains, a razor's edge that sliced through skeletal trees and howled against the battered siding of a sagging farmhouse. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and deliberate, burying wagon ruts and boot prints, as if to erase all evidence of passage. On the crooked wooden porch stood Laura May, her small hands buried in the coarse wool of her shawl. The wind was merciless, yet she did not shiver. She had frozen somewhere deeper than the bone. Her eyes, wide and dry, stared out into the whiteness, searching for anything that might rise from the landscape to stop what was coming. Inside, her uncle leaned against the hearth, one boot propped on the stone edge as if he were still a man of power. He was thick-bodied and bitter, his face a map of regret and resentment. Across from him stood a taller man in a worn trail coat dusted with snow. Clayton Ward, 36, widowed. He held his hat in one hand, the other resting at his side. His face was unreadable, jaw set, his eyes the color of winter ash. "I told you," her uncle's voice rasped, sharp as splintered wood. "She's untouched, fresh as morning milk." Clayton said nothing. "She's strong, too, not soft like them saloon girls in town. Raised her on beans and chores. She can carry water, break kindling, mend cloth." He spit into the fire. "A woman like that ought to be worth more than $50, but I'm settling fair." Still, Clayton was silent. In the corner, the fire popped, a sharp crack in the heavy air. The silence between the two men grew thick, suffocating. Laura's fingers dug tighter into the fabric at her waist. She had not been asked for her thoughts, nor for her consent. To her uncle, she had never been more than a burden, another mouth that ate what he could not earn. Her mother had died when she was 12, and since then, no one had spoken her name with kindness. Outside, the wind howled, a rising, mournful sound. Clayton finally reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. It clinked as it landed on the table. Beside it, he laid a folded paper. Title to a prize bull. "We're square," the uncle said, rubbing his hands with a greedy satisfaction. "She's yours now." Clayton nodded once. He turned, opened the door, and stepped back out into the cold. Laura followed. She did not look back at the house. There was nothing left within its walls worth remembering. She descended the warped porch steps and stood in the snow beside him. He did not offer his arm. He did not ask if she needed a blanket. The wagon was simple and covered, built for function, not for comfort. She climbed in silently. He followed. When the door closed, the world outside dulled to a muffled hush, and the silence inside became deafening. Clayton took the reins and gave a low click of his tongue. The horses lurched forward, their hooves crunching against the ice-crusted snow. Laura kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. He did not speak, did not offer a single word, not even a glance. She did not ask where they were going, or how long it would take. She knew it didn't matter. In that moment, she was not a bride, not a wife, not even a woman. She was a transaction, a solution to someone else's problem. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. In this world, a girl's tears did not buy freedom. They only froze before they could fall. The Ward Ranch spread out before them like a frozen sea, quiet, vast, and unbearably still. As the wagon rolled past the front gate, a 2-story wooden house appeared, standing defiant against the wind, flanked by a barn and two smaller sheds. Snow on the roof had begun to melt at the edges, dripping steadily, like the ticking of a slow, indifferent clock. Clayton helped her down but said nothing more. He nodded once toward the front door, then turned and walked toward the barn, his footsteps fading behind her like the end of a sentence. Inside, the house was clean, orderly, and cold. It was not just the Wyoming winter that chilled the air, but something else, a silence that lived deep in the walls. There was no echo of laughter, no lingering warmth, just the soft creak of wood and the faint memory of what used to be. 3 children stood in the hallway, watching her with wide, guarded eyes. The smallest, Rosie, was barely 3, her hair a tangle of soft brown curls, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth. Eli, 6, held her hand protectively, his face solemn, his shoulders set like a little man's. And Micah, 8, stood behind them, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was already his father's son in posture, if not yet in age. None of them spoke. Laura offered a gentle, hesitant smile. "Hello," she said softly. Rosie blinked. Eli looked at the floor. Micah turned and walked away. This was the beginning. The days that followed passed in a rhythm of quiet uncertainty. Laura woke before dawn, fumbling through unfamiliar chores, hauling water, scrubbing floors, chopping vegetables, hanging linens, trying not to burn the bread. The stove was temperamental, the water pump crooked, the chickens hated her. She didn't know how to saddle a horse or soothe a child's nightmare. She didn't know where things were kept in the pantry, or how to sew a sock without stabbing her own finger. She did not know why Rosie cried when the clock struck 3, or why Eli refused to eat carrots. But she tried. Each morning she rose in the dark and tried to learn what this place, this life expected of her. Clayton never raised his voice. He did not criticize. He barely spoke at all. But every now and then, she would find small, unsigned notes pinned quietly beside the stove. Use oak for better heat. Boil potatoes before peeling. Rosie likes her porridge with cinnamon. One morning she found a slip of paper tucked under a cracked bowl. You don't have to do it all. Just try. She stared at the words longer than she should have. At night, long after she had gone to her room, she would sometimes hear footsteps downstairs. By morning, the dishes she had left half-washed would be clean and dry. The bread dough she had given up on would be baked into soft, round loaves. The firewood she forgot to bring in would be stacked neatly beside the hearth. He never said a word about it. The children remained distant. Rosie hid under the table. Eli hovered by windows, watching the horizon. Micah stayed outside long after dark, chopping wood as if it were the only thing in the world that made sense. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Laura baked small rounds of honey bread. She placed one on a chipped plate and left it outside Micah's door. He had not said a single word to her in 3 weeks. The next morning, the plate was gone. In its place was a single pine cone, its edges traced with black ink, as if by a child's hand. She didn't ask. He didn't mention it. But something small had shifted. Later that day, she passed through the kitchen and saw that someone with rough, calloused hands, had cleaned the soot from the stovetop. Not just wiped it, but cleaned it with care. And for the first time since her arrival, Laura exhaled without trembling. The sickness arrived without warning. One morning, Rosie refused her porridge. By midday, Her cheeks burned with fever, and her tiny body shook beneath her blankets. She whimpered when touched and cried softly in her sleep, calling out for someone who was no longer there. Laura did not panic. She couldn't afford to. She folded warm towels, soaked in water boiled with crushed mint leaves from the pantry, and laid them gently across Rosie's forehead. She slipped the girl's dress off and curled beside her in the bed, wrapping her own arms around the child like a cocoon, offering a warmth the fire could not provide. For 3 nights, Laura did not sleep. She held Rosie when she cried, sang to her when a cough rattled her small chest, and whispered soft prayers she had made up herself, just to fill the silence. When Rosie's throat went dry and her lips cracked, Laura dipped her fingers into honeyed water and placed drops onto the girl's tongue, one by one. On the third night, sometime after midnight, she glanced toward the window. Clayton was standing outside. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, but he made no move to enter. His face was a mask, but his eyes, those distant gray eyes, were changed. He stood there, unmoving, watching while Laura rocked his daughter in her arms like something precious. He left without a word. The next morning, Rosie's fever broke. Her breathing softened. She opened her eyes and blinked slowly, her lips chapped but no longer trembling. When Laura offered her a sip of water, the child drank, then clutched weakly at her sleeve. "Thank you, Mama Laura," she whispered. The words struck like thunder in a quiet sky. Laura smiled gently, brushed a curl from Rosie's damp forehead, and said nothing. That night, Laura told the children a story by the fireplace, a tale about a coyote who stole the stars and had to put them back one by one. Rosie sat in her lap. Eli leaned against her knee. Micah sat apart, silent, but watching. Afterward, she tucked Rosie into bed and kissed her brow. The little girl didn't resist. She reached up and held Laura's hand until she drifted to sleep. Still, Micah kept his distance. He helped his father with the horses, cleaned the barn, chopped wood, and offered her little more than silence. Laura respected it. She didn't force kindness where it was not yet welcome. But one cold morning, just after the first thaw, she walked out to the field behind the house with a bundle of small branches in her arms. The grave marker there was weather-worn and crooked. Clara Ward, beloved wife and mother. No flowers, no offering, just a name carved into old wood. Laura sat in the snow, her fingers red and numb, and began to work. She tied twine around 3 pine branches, fashioning them into a crude but careful cross. She laid it gently at the base of the marker. She didn't know she was being watched. That evening, Micah was silent through supper, but as Laura cleaned up, he walked into the kitchen and muttered, "You spelled her name right." Laura paused, drying her hands on a towel. "I made sure." Micah nodded once, then walked out again. Later that night, Miriam, an older neighbor who sometimes helped with sewing, visited briefly to drop off fabric. As she put on her coat to leave, she leaned toward Laura and whispered, "Do you know you're the first person Clayton's let into that room since Clara passed?" Laura blinked. "What room?" "The one you've been caring for Rosie in." "That was Clara's room. He hadn't touched the doorknob in 3 years." Outside, snow began to fall again. Clayton remained a silent figure in the house. He never offered praise, never spoke of what he saw. But Laura noticed the way he sometimes paused when passing the children's room, how he stood a moment longer outside the kitchen when she laughed at one of Eli's jokes, how his hand would brush the doorframe after she walked through. as if grounding himself to the space she had just occupied. And more than once, when she looked up suddenly, she caught his eyes on her, soft, uncertain, searching. But he always turned away before she could hold his gaze. Still, something had begun to shift. It was not love, not yet. But it was no longer silence. It was a quiet evening, brittle with cold. The wind had stilled, and the snow outside lay untouched, a blanket no one dared disturb. Laura had just finished folding the last of the children's clothes when she heard voices, deep and male, coming from the barn. Curious, but cautious, she slipped out onto the porch and followed the low rumble of sound. The barn door was slightly ajar. She stood still, careful not to breathe too loudly. Inside, Clayton stood by a lantern, his gloved hands resting on a saddle rack. Opposite him, a man with a thick beard and a laugh that echoed too loudly leaned against a post. "So," the man smirked, his voice slick with insinuation. "How's married life treatin' you? That girl can't be more than, what, 18?" Clayton didn't answer right away. The man continued, his tone mocking. "You must be having a fine time with a young thing like that. Bet she keeps the bed warmer than the firewood does, eh?" Laura's breath caught in her throat. Clayton's voice came, low and even. "I took her because it was convenient. There are no feelings involved. I just needed someone to keep the house in order, care for the children." The other man chuckled crudely. "That all, huh?" Clayton gave a short nod. "That's all." Laura did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked away, her chest tight, her vision blurring at the edges. Her hands trembled as she opened the door to the house and stepped back into the dark hallway. The warmth of the fire mocked her now. The walls that had begun to feel familiar pressed in around her like a cage. She climbed the stairs to her small room, the house silent save for the creak of wood and the frantic beating of her own heart. In that profound silence, she wrote the letter. The words were not a plea, but a quiet declaration. "If I am only a shadow, then let me disappear into the snow. I will not wait for spring." She folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table, beside a small bowl of dried herbs intended for the next day's soup. Then, from her drawer, she took the only thing she had ever truly called her own, a worn leather belt Clayton had repaired without her asking. The stitching was uneven, the thread thick and rough, but it had held ever since. She laid it beside the letter. Outside, the sky had turned a pale, unforgiving silver. She wrapped herself in her coat, pulled her scarf high over her mouth, and stepped out into the snow. The wind did not greet her. It simply opened its arms and let her vanish into the dark. It was Eli who woke first. He stumbled from his bed, calling her name softly. When he couldn't find her in the kitchen, or by the fire where she sometimes slept when Rosie was restless, his calls grew louder. "Laura!" Then a child's fractured sob. The sound woke Rosie, who began wailing. Micah came down next, confused and barefoot. Clayton descended the stairs 2 at a time. When he saw the letter, his face went pale. When he saw the belt, he closed his eyes. And when Eli cried out her name again, in a voice so broken it could have come from a grown man's chest, Clayton didn't hesitate. He threw on his coat, grabbed his rifle, and ran to the stable. Within minutes, he was gone, riding hard into the night, the snow rising up to meet him like the edge of a cliff. He found her near dawn. The snow had lightened, but not stopped, and her tracks were nearly gone. But he followed them with an instinct that defied logic. He rode hard, through thickets and across a frozen creek, until he reached the old stream beyond the hills, where water still ran dark beneath sheets of ice. There, on a fallen log, he saw her. Laura sat curled in on herself, her scarf damp with frost. Her lips were pale, her cheeks flushed with a dangerous cold. She looked small, breakable. He dismounted quietly, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. When she looked up, her eyes met his, but she did not speak. He stood before her for a long moment. Then, without a word, Clayton dropped to one knee in the snow. The breath caught in her throat. He didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't scold. Instead, his voice came out, a rough and broken whisper. "I didn't mean for you to hear that." She looked away. "I said it to shut him up," he went on, his words raw. "He was making jokes about you and me. I thought I was protecting your name." He swallowed hard. "But I hurt you instead." Laura didn't answer. Her hands shook in her lap. Clayton took a ragged breath. Then he said the words like a man unearthing something long buried. "I don't know how to love right," he whispered. "I didn't grow up with it. And when Clara died, I sealed the door shut and threw away the key. I thought that was safer for everyone." His voice cracked. "But then you came," he said, his eyes shining now. "And somehow, without asking for a thing, you gave everything. You made Rosie laugh again. You taught Eli to sleep without waking up crying. Micah, he watches you like he's afraid you'll disappear." A tear slipped down his cheek, startling in its simplicity. "You made this house breathe again." He lowered his head. "And I never once said thank you." Laura blinked, her own lips trembling, but still she was silent. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "But if you do, I won't stop you. Just tell me you'll be warm, that you'll be safe." She stared at him, the man she had feared, then endured, then slowly, quietly, begun to understand. And finally, she spoke, her voice a whisper of its own. "I didn't want you to love me. I just wanted to matter." Clayton looked up at her, his gaze holding hers. "You do," he said, "more than you know." The tears came then, quiet and slow and freeing. Laura reached out a hand, and he rose from the snow to meet her. In his arms, the cold finally melted away. There were no promises made, no vows exchanged, just the profound silence between two people who had stopped running and started listening. Spring returned to Wyoming quietly. The snow gave way to soft green shoots, and the hills rolled out their colors like a quilt. Yellows, blues, and pinks scattered among the tall grasses. On one such morning, as mist clung low over the pasture, Clayton saddled two horses without a word of explanation. "Ride with me," he said simply, handing Laura the reins. She didn't ask questions. She had learned that with him, silence often carried more meaning than words. They rode side by side through the open land, past the grazing cattle and the ridge where Micah liked to fly paper kites. The wind brushed gently across her face, and for the first time, it felt like the land itself was breathing again. He led her to a clearing she had never seen before, a wide open field blanketed in wildflowers, golden poppies, purple asters, blue columbine. The whole earth seemed to sway with the wind, a silent lullaby. Laura dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft ground. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Clayton nodded, dismounting beside her. His face was a mask, revealing nothing, but his hand was steady as he led her a few steps further, to a place where a small stone marker rested in the shade of a twisted oak. The tree was ancient, its bark a roadmap of seasons past, its branches thick and sheltering. She read the name carved into the weathered stone. Clara Ward, beloved wife, mother, keeper of peace. Clayton removed his hat, holding it respectfully over his heart. This was her favorite place, he said, his voice quiet against the sigh of the wind. She used to bring the children here when they were just babies. Said this field made her believe in heaven more than any church pew ever could. Laura remained silent, her hands folded before her. I scattered her ashes here, he continued, his gaze fixed on the stone. 3 years ago. Promised I wouldn't let the land forget her. The wind picked up again, a soft, cool caress. Laura turned toward him, but he was already reaching into his coat pocket. From the lining he drew a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He handed it to her with a reverence usually reserved for things holy or fragile. Inside was a string of pearls. They were slightly yellowed with age, yet polished to a soft luster, and felt warm in her hand. They belonged to my mother, he explained. She gave them to Clara on our wedding day. Said they should stay in the family, passed down to the woman who would raise the next generation of Wards. Laura stared at the necklace, a breath caught in her chest. I didn't give them to you when we married, he went on, finally meeting her eyes. Because I didn't see it as a marriage. I saw it as survival. His gaze was steady now, open and vulnerable. But now, he said, his voice softening, I see you waking before the sun to braid Rosie's curls. I see the way Eli looks for your nod before feeding the hens. And Micah, that boy hasn't called anyone mama in years, but I think if he ever does again, it'll be you. Clayton reached for her hand, his touch not forceful, just present. I want my children to grow up calling you mother, he said, the words simple, yet heavier than any vow. There was no grand proposal, no dramatic gesture, no wine, no music. There was only the sway of wildflowers in the wind, the whisper of leaves overhead, and the worn, quiet warmth of a man finally laying his heart bare. Laura didn't speak. She couldn't. But with trembling fingers, she took the pearls and fastened them around her neck. And when she looked back at Clayton, her eyes were filled with something neither of them dared to name, but both understood completely. The storm rolled in without warning. By mid-afternoon, the sky had bruised to an angry gray, and the wind howled across the prairie like a wounded animal. In their pens, the horses grew restless, snorting and stomping, their eyes wide with an ancient fear. Laura was in the kitchen when the scream came. It wasn't long, just a single sharp cry that tore through the wind's howl and pierced the walls like a blade. The ladle fell from her hand with a clatter. Barefoot, she ran out into the yard, Rosie trailing close behind, clutching a small doll, her face a mask of confusion and fright. Near the barn doors, Eli stood crying, his knees scraped raw, his small body trembling. It's Micah, he sobbed, pointing a shaking finger. He pushed me away from the horse. It was mad. By the time Laura had scooped the sobbing boy into her arms, Clayton was already mounted. He didn't say a word. His face was white as bone, his jaw set like granite. He galloped toward the far end of the pasture, where the mustangs were kept. a man riding into his own worst fear. They found Micah crumpled in the churned mud, terrifyingly still. Clayton dismounted, lifting him with arms that trembled, holding his son's limp body close to his chest. The boy's head lolled back. A streak of blood matted his hair at the temple. His boots dangled like dead weight. "Micah, no, no, no," Clayton muttered, a desperate prayer against his son's cold forehead. They rode hard back to the house, and for days, the ranch was locked in a suffocating silence. The doctor came and went, his face grim, his head shaking. "He's young, strong," he'd said, "but the brain, well, sometimes it just takes time." Time. Laura sat by Micah's bed day and night. She barely ate, barely slept. She read from a small, leather-bound Bible, her voice a low murmur, or sometimes just her lips moving in silent prayer. Clayton couldn't stay in the room for long. Each time he looked at his still, pale son, he seemed to collapse inward. "I never should have let him work the corral," he said once, his voice a hoarse whisper of guilt. "He's just a boy. I wanted to make him strong, but I broke him." "You didn't," Laura said gently, her hand on his arm. "He tried to save his brother. That's a strength you can't teach." But Clayton only shook his head and walked away, a man haunted by his own love. On the fourth night, as the wind outside finally quieted and the lamps burned low, Laura leaned close to Micah's ear. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We're all waiting on you, sweetheart. Rosie made a drawing today with your name on it. Eli's been sleeping with your boots by his bed. And your father, he blames himself for everything." She reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, as her own tears fell, dampening the pillow beside him. "You're not allowed to give up on us, Micah Ward. Not when we've finally learned how to love again." The room was still, the only sound her own quiet breath. Then, his hand twitched. Laura gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She leaned in closer. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, bleary, confused, but awake. "Micah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Micah, can you hear me?" He blinked, his gaze slowly finding hers. Then, in a weak, raspy voice that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, he asked, "Mama, did you cry for me?" Laura's hand flew to her mouth as the tears came faster, a silent, sobbing confirmation. At the doorway, Clayton heard that one simple word. "Mama." He staggered back against the wall, pressing a fist to his chest, as if to hold his own fractured heart together. The boy had come back to them. But more than that, he had chosen her. The wedding was small. There were no musicians, no grand procession, just the wind rustling through the wildflowers and the sun warming the soft earth beneath their feet. Clayton had chosen the same clearing where Clara's ashes rested, where the ancient oak stood as a silent witness. Laura wore a simple ivory dress, sewn by hand with lace Rosie had discovered in an old attic chest. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and around her neck gleamed the pearl necklace. Micah stood tall beside his father in a neatly pressed vest, a wildflower pinned crookedly to his chest by Eli. Rosie, wearing a crown of daisies, clutched her own small bouquet upside down, humming a tune only she seemed to know. Each child held one of Laura's hands as she walked into the clearing, and Clayton, waiting for her beneath the oak in a crisp white shirt that hadn't seen daylight in years, smiled a smile that seemed to erase the hard years from his face. "I never thought I'd stand here again," he said when she reached him, his voice thick with emotion. But I thank God I am. The preacher spoke of second chances, of love that is patient and kind. But it was their vows that stilled the air. Clayton took her hands in his grip firm and sure. I buried my heart under this tree, he said, his voice holding the gravity of a man who knew the cost of loss. But you came and made it bloom again. You're not just the woman I married. You're the home I thought I'd never have again. Laura blinked back tears. I wasn't looking for a family, she answered, her voice clear and strong. I didn't know how to be a wife or a mother. But you, Clayton, you gave me the chance to try. And your children, they taught me how to stay. When they kissed, the wind picked up, sending petals swirling around them like confetti. It was Rosie who cheered first, and Micah who stepped forward and said with a solemn nod, You look beautiful, Mama. Later, as twilight softened the sky, they shared a simple feast of roast chicken and warm bread. For the first time, the house felt truly whole, its rooms filled with easy laughter. But just then, a wagon appeared at the edge of the property. An old man, hunched and pale, stepped down. Laura froze. It was her uncle. His face was sunken, his hands shaking as he clutched a worn hat to his chest. I heard tell there was a wedding, he said, his voice thin. And I just wanted to say, I did you wrong, girl. I sold you like a sack of flour, and God knows I've paid for it. Clayton stood close beside her, a silent, watchful shadow. I don't expect forgiveness, the old man continued, but I needed to speak it out loud before I meet my maker. Laura looked at him for a long moment. You took away my choice, she said, her voice even. But in a strange way, that road led me here. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his frail shoulder. I forgive you, but I won't forget. He nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. That's fair. As the old man turned and walked slowly back to his wagon, Clayton wrapped an arm around her. You didn't have to do that, he murmured into her hair. I did, she whispered. For me. A few weeks later, the skies broke open with a warm spring rain. Laura stood barefoot in the field, her dress soaked through, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Clayton joined her in the downpour, lifting her face to the sky. I lost one good woman to heaven, he said softly, but God in his mercy gave me another. You didn't just save me, Laura. You saved this whole family. She leaned into his chest as the rain fell, steady and kind. That afternoon, together with the children, they planted a young cottonwood tree beside the oak, its blossoms a promise of new life. Let it grow, Clayton said, patting the dark, rich soil, through drought and through storm. And when it flowers, Laura added, a hand on her belly, we'll know that love still lives here. And so it did, through all the seasons that followed. The story of the Wards is a testament to the wild, stubborn nature of hope, a belief that love can bloom in the harshest of winters, and that broken people can still build something whole. If their journey stirred something in you, share your favorite moment in the comments below. We have to ask, do you believe that second chances can become life's greatest blessings? For more tales of quiet devotion, fierce hearts, and love surviving on the wild frontier, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and turn on notifications. Because out here, Under the wide American sky, love is never an easy ride, but it's always worth it.